So now we'll be talking about ionic compounds. These ionic compounds are actually made up of ions, and we all know what are ions. Ions are the elements which have either loosen और गेन द चार्ज. जब भी एक एलिमेंट अपना चार्ज लूज कर देता है हम उसे कैटायन बोल देते हैं और पॉजिटिव चार्ज वाला. ऑन द अदर हैंड जब भी एक एलिमेंट अपना इलेक्ट्रॉन गेन करता है, एक इलेक्ट्रॉन को गेन करता है, उसे हम एनायन बोलते हैं और नेगेटिव चार्ज. तो कैटायंस यूजुअली हमारे होते हैं मेटल्स. कैटायंस आर यूजुअली मेटल्स whereas anions are usually non-metals. तो हम ये भी कह सकते हैं कि एक ionic compound बनता है एक metal और एक non-metal के बीच में. So now let us consider some examples of ionic compound. For example, sodium chloride. ये किससे बना है? एक metal और एक non-metal के combination से. सोडियम एक metal है, क्लोरीन एक non-metal है. तो सोडियम क्लोराइड किसका एग्जाम्पल हो गया? एक ionic compound का. Similarly, magnesium oxide भी ionic compound का एग्जाम्पल है. Magnesium chloride भी ionic compound का एग्जाम्पल है. एल्यूमिनियम क्लोराइड भी आयोनिक कंपाउंड का एग्जाम्पल है. पोटेशियम क्लोराइड भी आयोनिक कंपाउंड का एग्जाम्पल है. तो ये सब आयोनिक कंपाउंड्स बनते कैसे हैं ये अभी हम पढ़ेंगे. द वेरी फर्स्ट एग्जाम्पल विच वी विल बी टेकिंग इज हाउ सोडियम क्लोराइड इज फॉर्म्ड. So we know the atomic number of sodium, that is Na, is 11. And how we will electronic configure it as 2, 8, 1. And the next element is chlorine. Chlorine's atomic number is 17, which we will electronic configure it as 2, 8, 7. So these are the two elements which we require in the formation of sodium chloride. When an ionic compound is formed, it always requires its outermost electrons, or we call it as valence electrons. So sodium has one electron in its outermost shell, and if I'll talk about chlorine, chlorine has 7 electrons in its outermost shell. As you could notice, it's because of the valence electron configuration. Now sodium has one electron, and to complete its octet, sodium needs to lose one electron. And if I'll talk about chlorine, chlorine has 7 electrons in its outermost shell. So if sodium will give 1 electron to chlorine, what will happen? Sodium will lose 1 electron and chlorine will gain 1 electron. The one which loses attains positive charge and the one which gains attains negative charge. And due to the formation of ions, a bond has been created called as an ionic bond. And the compound which shows this ionic bond is called as ionic compound. So for making an ionic compound, the very first thing is that we must know the formula. So if you could notice in magnesium chloride, and you all must remember in class 9th you have learned that the valency helps in the formation of the formula. We know the valency of magnesium is 2 and chlorine is 1. So the formula is magnesium chloride. Now since I have got this formula as MgCl2, I need to make this ionic compound of this formula. So we know, as we could observe in the formula, magnesium is 1 and chlorine is 2. So for making the ionic compound, I need to have 1 magnesium and 2 chlorine. So for drawing the formula, we must know the atomic number. Magnesium atomic number is 12, which can be electronic configured as 2, 8, 2. And chlorine electronic number is 17, which can be electronic configured as 2, 8, 7. So I'll draw 2 electrons in the case of magnesium and 7 in the case of each chlorine. So this is the way that valence electrons needs to be drawn. If you'll notice, magnesium has 2 electrons, and to get stable, magnesium has to lose 2 electrons, whereas chlorine has to gain 1 because it has 7 in the outermost shell, and to stable, the element needs to have 8 electrons. So magnesium will give 1 electron to chlorine and will give another electron to another chlorine. So we could conclude that magnesium loses 2 electrons. Since magnesium is losing 2 electrons, we will write 2 positive because the one which loses attains positive charge. Whereas chlorine is gaining 1, but we have 2 chlorines in it. So the formula becomes like MgCl2. This is the ionic bond formation of magnesium chloride. For ionic bond formation of calcium oxide, first we need to make its formula. As I told you, calcium and oxygen. Calcium has 2 electrons in its outermost shell and its valency is 2, whereas oxygen also has 2. So if we'll make the formula, it will become like Ca2O2, and after on cutting 2 and 2 will give you CaO. So that is the formula of calcium oxide. If I write about the atomic number of calcium, it's 20 and it splits like 2, 8, 8, 2. And if I talk about oxygen, the atomic number of oxygen is 8 and it splits like 2, 6. For making the ionic compound, we need to have valence electron in its outermost shell. So calcium has 2 valence electrons in its outermost shell, whereas oxygen has 6. As you could notice, it's mentioned 6 in the valence electron. Now for making the ionic compound, calcium needs to lose electrons so that it can have 8 electrons in its outermost shell, and oxygen needs to gain 2 so that it can also have 2 electrons in its outermost shell. So what will happen? Calcium will give its 2 electrons to the oxygen. So how will the formation takes place? Calcium has loosened 2 electrons, whereas oxygen has gained 2 electrons, giving the formula CaO. This is the correct way to present the ionic compound formation of calcium oxide. So the very first step for the formation of an ionic compound is to make the formula. Aluminium and oxygen. The valency of aluminium is 3, while the valency of oxygen is 2. When we will crisscross, we will get the formula Al2O3. Now, as the formula depicts, we need to take how many aluminium? 2 aluminium and 3 oxygen. If we talk about oxygen, the atomic number is 8 and its electronic configuration is 2, 6. So now we will be drawing the structure of aluminium oxide. As the formula depicts, I need to take 2 aluminium and 3 oxygen. This is an important ionic compound which usually comes in the board. So aluminium has 3 electrons in its outermost shell. As we have discussed over here, we need to draw the valence electrons. So there are 3 valence electrons in aluminium. And how many in oxygen? 6. So I need to draw 6 oxygen in each of the oxygen. So I hope you are clear how to take the electrons in the elements. The electrons are always the valence electrons. That means the electrons in the outermost shell. So I have taken aluminium's valence electron as 3 and oxygen as 6 as per their electronic configuration. Now aluminium needs to lose 3 for getting stable. This oxygen requires only 2. So I have given 2 electrons to this oxygen. Now coming up to the next oxygen, it also requires 2. So I have given 1 from the first aluminium and second from the another aluminium. Moving ahead, 2 electrons to the last oxygen. So in this way, all the electrons have been loosened by 2 aluminium and 3 oxygen have taken 2 electrons each from aluminium. So yes, how we will write it as? We will write it as that aluminium has loosened 3 electrons. And how many aluminium are there? We have 2 aluminium. Oxygen has gained 2 electrons. And how many oxygen we have? 3. So the formula becomes like Al2O3. I hope these certain examples have cleared your concepts for the ionic compound formation. If you are facing any problem, just write it in the chat box that you need an ionic compound formation for the particular compound, and I'll help you out with the particular question or your particular query. Thanks for giving your precious time to subscribe and like my channel. Have a good day.